Hey guys, tonight we wander back, far, far back, to the banks of the Nile, where the land breathes in rhythm with the river, and the story of grain begins long before anyone ever built a granary. Picture yourself barefoot in the soft, dark mud of the floodplain, the scent of wet earth rising around you as papyrus rustles in the morning breeze. The air hums with dragonflies, and somewhere nearby, a farmer is swatting a fly off the back of his ox. This is Egypt, not the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids you usually imagine, but the quieter, humbler Egypt of grain and water and waiting. And here's a little reality check. If you were actually here, you probably wouldn't survive this. The sun alone would roast you like a date in a marketplace, and the annual floods would sweep you away if the crocodiles didn't get you first. But lucky for you, we're just visiting in spirit, cozy, safe, and possibly already yawning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the silt left behind by the latest inundation. The Nile has just withdrawn, leaving the land glossy and fertile, like the earth itself has exhaled. Around you, fields stretch as far as the eye can see, dotted with laborers sowing seeds by hand. They cast them from woven baskets with a practiced rhythm, step and sweep, trusting that the river's gift will turn these tiny grains into next year's bread. This is the first stage of Egypt's grain story, the land and the flood. Every year, like clockwork, the river rises in the summer, swelling with water and rich Ethiopian silt, then retreats in autumn, leaving behind a narrow strip of arable land. Without this natural irrigation, Egypt would be little more than endless desert. The ancient Egyptians even had a name for this cycle, heqat, the inundation, followed by peret, the growing season, and finally shemu, the harvest. You live and die by those rhythms, and if you mess up the timing of planting or harvesting, well, there's no supermarket down the street to bail you out. You sling a woven basket over your shoulder and help scatter grain across the wet fields. It's mostly emmer, wheat, and barley, hardy crops that thrive in the Nile Valley's peculiar mix of sun and silt. Emmer especially is Egypt's staple. It's tougher than modern wheat and gives bread a dense, chewy texture. People back then weren't baking fluffy baguettes. Their bread was thick, filling, and a little gritty, thanks to sand from the grindstones. Think of it as the world's first artisanal stone-ground loaf, though probably with more actual stones in it. Once the seeds are in the earth, there's little left to do but wait. And that's where the first layer of ancient anxiety sets in. Too little flood, and the fields won't support the harvest. Too much, and the crops drown. Historians still argue whether the earliest Nile farmers developed precise flood level measurements this early or relied purely on experience and temple predictions. But either way, everyone's eyes stay fixed on the water. The Nile is generous, but she's not always consistent. Fast forward a few months, and you're back in these same fields, but now they're golden and humming with life. The harvest season is brutal. It's hot, dusty work, and every stalk matters. You swing a curved sickle, serrated with flint blades, slicing through bundles of grain. The dry husks scratch your arms, the sun burns your neck, and the rhythmic swish-thunk of sickles fills the air. Still, there's something satisfying about it. This is the moment when potential becomes reality. The whole community turns out for the harvest. Men, women, children, everyone has a job. Some cut, some bind, some carry bundles to threshing floors, and some, inevitably, stand around and supervise. Yes, even 4,000 years ago, management still existed. The fields become a choreography of movement and noise, a communal race against time before the unforgiving desert winds scatter the ripe heads of grain. And yet, despite the bustle, there's a ritual quality to it all. The harvest isn't just labor, it's devotion. Offerings of the first sheaves go to the gods, especially Renenutit, the cobra-headed goddess of nourishment and plenty. Farmers might pour out a little beer or scatter a handful of grain on the ground as thanks. Quirky tidbit, there's evidence that some communities held small grain dances at the start of harvest, part prayer, part celebration, and part excuse to drink early. When the final stalk is cut and the last sheaf gathered, a deep sigh seems to roll across the land. But this is only the beginning of the grain's journey. You still have to move it, thousands of heavy, scratchy bundles, from scattered fields to the threshing floors and eventually to granaries that might be miles away. And here, the Nile becomes your greatest ally again. Barges loaded with grain glide down the slow, steady current, stacked high and smelling faintly sweet as the kernels dry. Even today, archaeologists debate how organized this transport system was in the Old Kingdom, whether temples ran fleets of state-owned grain barges or whether villagers simply pooled resources and paddled downstream themselves. Either way, you're part of that chain. You push a creaking cart piled high with sacks to a waiting boat. The river laps gently against the hull as you and your neighbors stack the cargo. The sky glows orange as the sun dips low over the floodplain. Somewhere, an ibis croaks from the reeds, and for a moment, you pause and breathe it in. The smell of earth, the hiss of the water, the distant sound of a temple drum marking the season. The harvest has ended, but the story of your grain has only just begun. Ahead lie threshing floors and granaries, scribes and tax collectors, temple storehouses and rat-proof chambers. But before any of that, before the measuring and sealing and storing, there is this: the patient waiting, the frantic cutting, the loading and floating, the humble, everyday rhythm of field and flood. And that rhythm is what sustained Egypt for millennia. It fed the workers who hauled stone for the pyramids, the priests who kept temples humming, the soldiers who marched across Nubia and beyond. Grain wasn't just food, it was power, currency, and civilization itself. And here, standing barefoot in the cooling mud of a harvested field, you feel that truth settling around you like dusk. The Nile, ever patient, ever steady, will rise again. The fields will green again, and the cycle, as ancient and inevitable as time itself, will begin anew. The harvest is done. The fields lie stubbled and quiet, and now the real alchemy begins. Grain in its raw form is still wrapped in husk and stalk, a treasure hidden inside layers of straw. To make it useful, to transform it into bread, beer, and wages, you first have to separate the edible from the inedible. And for that, you head to one of the most important and least glamorous places in ancient Egypt, the threshing floor. You trudge along the edge of the village toward a wide, hard-packed circle of earth. It's deliberately positioned in a slightly breezy spot, away from the houses and temples, because what happens here creates a storm of dust, chaff, and noise. Underfoot, the ground is sun-baked and firm, pounded flat by centuries of hooves and feet. At first glance, it looks unremarkable, a bare patch of land, perhaps 20 paces across. But this unassuming circle is the beating heart of the agricultural year. Without it, all that work under the scorching sun would have been for nothing. Waiting at the threshing floor are the animals, usually donkeys or oxen, sometimes even goats if they're feeling chaotic, and a handful of weary farmers. The air is dry and gritty, and already the scent of crushed straw lingers. Your task is simple but exhausting. Free the grain from its protective casing. The method hasn't changed much since agriculture began. You pile the harvested sheaves onto the floor, forming a thick mat of stalks and seed heads. Then the animals are driven in circles over it, hooves pounding rhythmically, breaking the husks and loosening the kernels. It's a strangely hypnotic process to watch. Dust rises in soft golden clouds, catching the late afternoon sun. The animals grunt and snort, plodding on with patient indifference. Children run behind them, laughing, their feet leaving swirling patterns in the chaff. Somewhere nearby, someone starts singing, a slow, repetitive tune meant to keep the pace. And you, brush in hand, turn the broken stalks to make sure every part is trampled. This is threshing, simple, and deeply satisfying. By the end of the day, the stubborn husks have surrendered, and the once solid sheaves are now a chaotic mix of straw, broken stems, and freed kernels. But you're not done yet. Those golden kernels are still mixed with bits of chaff and debris. To separate them, you need the wind. Winnowing is the elegant counterpoint to threshing's brute force. Once the grain has been beaten loose, you scoop it up with wide flat baskets and toss it into the air. The heavier kernels fall back down to the floor. The lighter chaff, husks, bits of straw, and dust, catches the breeze and drifts away. It's a beautifully simple technique, one that relies entirely on Egypt's dry air and predictable afternoon winds. You find your rhythm quickly. Scoop, lift, toss, and watch the breeze do the rest. There's a timelessness to it. You could close your eyes and imagine farmers doing exactly this 500 years earlier, or 500 years later. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians invented winnowing baskets themselves or borrowed the idea from even earlier Mesopotamian farmers, but either way, it's one of humanity's most enduring technologies. It's also one of those rare tasks that's both functional and strangely peaceful. With every toss, the grain becomes a little purer, a little closer to becoming bread. It's also a social event. Winnowing days are busy, noisy affairs. Children chase the drifting chaff, trying to catch it midair. Women bring out baskets of dates and beer for the workers. Old men sit in the shade, offering unsolicited advice that nobody listens to. And through it all, the sound of the wind and the rustle of falling kernels becomes almost meditative. It's a bit like ancient ASMR if you think about it, soothing, repetitive, and deeply satisfying, minus the part where you end the day covered in itchy straw. Once the winnowing is finished, the clean grain is gathered into piles and measured. But before we get to the precise art of measurement in the next stage, there's still one more step. The straw and husks left behind aren't simply waste. They're collected for animal bedding, fuel, and even building material. In Egypt, almost nothing goes to waste. Even the dust of the harvest has a purpose. You squat by the growing mound of grain, running a handful through your fingers. It's warm from the sun and smells faintly sweet. This is wealth. Not gold, not jewels, but the quiet wealth that keeps people alive. A good harvest means full bellies, paid workers, and satisfied gods. A poor one means hunger, unrest, and desperate prayers. And here's a quirky little tidbit. Some temple records mention offerings of chaff, yes, the useless leftovers, burned as a symbolic gift to the gods. Apparently, the gesture mattered more than the content. Now that the grain is free and clean, it's ready to be counted, stored, and distributed. But those steps require careful control, and the Egyptians, perhaps more than any other ancient people, loved order. Grain was too important to leave to chance. Officials inspected threshing floors, scribes recorded yields, and priests performed blessings over the stored harvest. In fact, some scholars believe threshing and winnowing had ritual significance beyond the practical. Certain temple texts use the process as a metaphor for purification. The idea that, just as grain is separated from chaff, the soul must be separated from impurities. Historians still debate whether these metaphors influenced actual farming rituals or were purely symbolic, but it's fascinating to think of a farmer's daily grind as something cosmic. Of course, not everything about the threshing floor was poetic. There were disagreements, too, about how much grain a field should have produced, about whether a neighbor's animals wandered onto the floor, about whether a tax official's estimate was suspiciously low. Ancient bureaucracy, as it turns out, could be just as frustrating as the modern kind. But no matter how much bickering happened on the edges, the The work itself remained constant, predictable, and essential. As the day draws to a close, the last of the chaff has drifted away, the animals have been led back to their pens, and the air smells faintly of crushed wheat and sweat. The threshing floor is quiet now, save for the crunch of your sandals on the hardened earth. Before you stands a mound of clean, shimmering grain, thousands of individual kernels, each a tiny capsule of potential. Together, they are the result of months of labor and the foundation of months to come. It's a strangely humble sight. There's no grandeur here, no monuments or inscriptions, no dramatic ceremonies. Just a dusty circle, a breeze, and a mountain of grain. And yet, this moment, this separation of treasure from husk, is as crucial to Egypt's greatness as any pyramid or temple. Without it, nothing else that follows would be possible. You stretch your back, sore from the day's work, and glance toward the horizon. Beyond it lies the next step in the grain's long journey, the meticulous art of measurement, where baskets and cubits, scribes and scales transform a pile of kernels into wealth on papyrus. But from now, you let the breeze play across your face, watching the last golden flecks of chaff swirl away into the fading light. Tomorrow, the grain will be counted. Tonight, it simply is, the quiet, weighty promise of life stored in every kernel. The threshing floor is behind you now, the air still clinging to your clothes with the smell of crushed husks, and ahead lies one of the most surprisingly complicated parts of ancient Egyptian life, figuring out how much grain you actually have. Because before a single kernel is eaten, stored, or offered to a temple, it has to be counted, measured, and recorded. And in a civilization as obsessed with order as Egypt, that process is almost sacred. You walk toward a shaded courtyard near the edge of the village, where the real work of accounting takes place. Here, the grain is poured from woven baskets into larger piles, each destined for a different purpose: temple offerings, royal taxes, local storage, and of course, the family's own supply. Scribes sit cross-legged on reed mats with pallets of ink and papyrus scrolls spread out before them, ready to capture every last detail. Their job isn't glamorous, but it's powerful. In ancient Egypt, numbers were power. The tools of measurement are deceptively simple. The most common unit for grain was the heqat, roughly 4.8 liters, a volume that could be measured out with a standard-sized basket or jar. There were smaller units too, like the row, which was 1/320th of a heqat, useful for more precise calculations, and for tax collectors trying to squeeze out every last drop of revenue. For larger amounts, scribes used the kar, equal to about 20 heqats. These measurements weren't random. They were standardized, often tied to temple rituals or government decrees, ensuring that a heqat of grain measured in Memphis was the same as one measured hundreds of miles away in Thebes. You scoop grain into a basket, feeling the weight pull at your shoulders. Then you pour it into a tall, narrow container carved from wood, its interior marked with carefully etched lines indicating exact volumes. Each time the grain reaches a line, a scribe calls out the number and records it with practiced ease. The sound of scribes muttering figures under their breath fills the air, a sort of ancient spreadsheet in human form. It's not just about counting what's there. Measurement is also about what should be there. Tax officials often estimated how much a field ought to produce based on its size and the Nile's flood level. If your harvest fell short, they might assume you were hiding grain and impose penalties. If it exceeded expectations, congratulations, you'd still probably owe more tax. Yes, bureaucracy hasn't changed much in 4,000 years. The IRS would be proud. Here's a mainstream historical fact that surprises many. Measuring grain wasn't just a local concern, it was a state-level operation. During the Middle Kingdom, royal inspectors toured the countryside after each harvest, checking yields and ensuring temple and royal granaries received their due. These inspectors reported back to the vizier, Egypt's top administrator, who oversaw national grain reserves. Grain measurement was, in a very real sense, a form of state surveillance. It told the government who was thriving, who was struggling, and where potential unrest might brew. But not all measuring was so official. In smaller villages, farmers often used everyday objects, like a specific basket, jar, or even a clay bowl, as informal units. These folk measurements varied from place to place, which could cause confusion and heated arguments when grain changed hands. Historians still argue whether the state's standardized units were strictly enforced in rural communities or whether local practices persisted well into the New Kingdom. The evidence suggests a bit of both. The crown preferred consistency, but practicality often won the day in remote settlements. There's a quirky side to all this too. Some grain measures doubled as metaphors or symbols in Egyptian culture. The heqat, for example, wasn't just a volume. It appeared in magical texts and religious inscriptions as a symbol of abundance and balance. In certain funerary spells, the deceased was promised heqats of grain without end, a poetic way of saying they'd never go hungry in the afterlife. Even mathematics was often explained through grain. School texts for apprentice scribes used grain problems to teach fractions and multiplication. Imagine doing word problems like, if one farmer owes 3 heqats and pays half a car, how much grain does he still owe? Ancient Egyptian math homework wasn't much fun either. Of course, the measuring process wasn't foolproof. Grain is a living thing. It swells with moisture, shrinks when dried, and changes weight over time. Officials were aware of this and sometimes tried to account for it, but mistakes and opportunities for fraud were common. A clever farmer might accidentally leave his grain in the sun too long, causing it to shrink and appear as if there was less than there really was. A corrupt official might dip the measuring jar a little lower, skimming off a portion for himself. Entire court cases were fought over disputes like these, with papyrus records detailing accusations of grain theft or false measurement. You heft another basket and pour it into the jar. The scribe scratches a line of ink across his papyrus, his eyes flicking up briefly to make sure you're not cheating. The process is slow and methodical. Basket after basket, jar after jar, number after number. Yet there's a quiet satisfaction to it. This isn't just counting grain. It's turning chaos into order, transforming a messy pile of kernels into something legible, manageable, and, most importantly, taxable. At the end of the day, the numbers tell a story. They reveal which fields were most fertile, which villages paid their dues on time, and which temples might need to tighten their belts. They also provide the foundation for Egypt's broader economy. Because grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Wages for workers, offerings to the gods, trade goods for foreign merchants, all were calculated in heqats and cars. Even debts were often repaid in grain rather than silver. Without accurate measurement, the entire system would collapse. You pause for a moment, wiping the sweat from your brow, and watch the scribes at work. Their reed pens scratch steadily across the papyrus, leaving behind neat columns of numbers and names. These humble documents, dusty, fragile, easily overlooked, are among the most valuable sources of information we have today. Thanks to them, we know not only how much grain was grown, but how it flowed through Egyptian society, who controlled it, who consumed it, and how it shaped every corner of daily life. The sun is dipping low when the final basket is measured. The scribes roll up their scrolls and seal them with lumps of wet clay impressed with official marks, a safeguard against tampering. The grain piles are neatly organized now, each labeled and accounted for. Tomorrow, they'll be divided, some stored away for lean years, some delivered to the temples, some loaded onto barges for transport to the capital. But for now, the day's work is done. You glance back at the field from which all this bounty came and feel a quiet sense of awe. A few months ago, it was just mud and seed. Now it's wealth measured down to the last kernel, a harvest transformed into mathematics and bureaucracy. And soon, that bureaucracy will give way to architecture, to the towering mud brick granaries where Egypt's future will be safeguarded against drought, rodents, and time itself. For now, though, you simply listen to the scratch of the scribes' pens and the soft whisper of grain sliding into jars. Measurement might not be as dramatic as a battle or a coronation, but in the story of Egypt's survival, it is every bit as important. The numbers are written, the jars are measured, and now the grain faces its next and perhaps most crucial destination, the granary. Because in a land where the Nile gives generously, but not always consistently, storing food isn't just practical, it's a matter of life and death. Egypt's survival depends on its ability to take this fragile harvest and make it last through months, even years of uncertainty. And that means building spaces worthy of the task. You step away from the measuring yard and follow a procession of laborers toward the edge of the settlement, where a cluster of rounded, mud brick towers rise from the earth like oversized beehives. These are no ordinary storehouses. They are carefully engineered, state-controlled fortresses of food, the backbone of Egypt's economy, and one of the quiet reasons its civilization endured for over 3,000 years. The granary complex is an impressive sight. At first glance, it almost looks like a miniature city within a city. Thick perimeter walls to deter thieves, narrow entrances easily guarded by a few men, and a maze of chambers, ramps, and courtyards. The air smells faintly of earth and dry grain. Donkeys bray as they drag heavy baskets through the main gate. The hum of activity is constant. People shouting measurements, scribes checking inventories, and workers disappearing into shadowy storage rooms with sacks slung over their shoulders. Each granary is built for both strength and preservation. The thick mud brick walls keep the interior cool during scorching days and trap warmth when desert nights turn cold. Tiny ventilation slits high on the walls allow air to circulate, reducing moisture and preventing rot. Floors are often raised slightly above ground level, keeping the grain safe from damp soil and creeping pests. And some granaries even slope gently inward at the base, making it harder for rodents to climb inside. An early example of pest-proof design long before the concept of food safety existed. The process of filling these structures is a carefully choreographed dance. Workers climb steep earthen ramps to pour grain through small openings at the top of each chamber. Once filled, these openings are sealed with thick mud plaster, a physical and symbolic gesture that transforms the chamber from an ordinary room into a secure vault. It will remain sealed until the grain is needed, whether that's next month, next year, or during a future famine no one yet imagines. As you watch, a scribe stands beside each chamber with a reed pen and papyrus, noting exactly how much grain goes in. Clay seal impressions are pressed into the wet plaster, the ancient equivalent of a security tag, bearing the names of officials, temples, or royal overseers responsible for the contents. These seals are more than bureaucracy. They're a form of accountability, ensuring that when the chamber is eventually opened, the grain inside matches what was recorded. If it doesn't, someone is going to have a very unpleasant conversation with the vizier. Here's a mainstream fact worth knowing. Granaries like these weren't just village affairs, they were state infrastructure. Pharaohs built vast storage complexes near administrative centers, temple precincts, and strategic military outposts. The largest could hold tens of thousands of heqats of grain, enough to feed entire cities. At the height of the New Kingdom, some granaries functioned almost like banks. People deposited grain, received receipts, and could withdraw equivalent amounts later, a rudimentary credit system based on bread rather than bronze. But granaries weren't purely practical. They were also deeply symbolic. In a land so dependent on the Nile's whims, a full granary was a sign of divine favor and royal competence. Some temples held annual ceremonies celebrating the sealing of the granaries, offering prayers to Renanut and Hapi, the god of the flood, for continued abundance. And the imagery of overflowing storehouses even made its way into tomb art, where scenes of servants pouring grain into vast silos symbolized eternal sustenance in the afterlife. Still, even the best-designed granary couldn't solve every problem. Grain was precious, and wherever there's something precious, there are always people willing to steal it. Thieves sometimes tunneled under walls, chipped through plaster seals, or bribed guards to look the other way. There's even a record from the Ramesside period describing a particularly bold theft in which a group of workers tried to replace stolen grain with sand, hoping no one would notice until long after they'd sold the real stuff. Spoiler, they were noticed. Historians still argue whether the most advanced storage systems were developed first by royal engineers or by temple administrators, who often had more consistent funding and long-term planning. What's certain is that both the state and the temples invested heavily in keeping their grains safe, because whoever controlled the granaries controlled Egypt itself. The stakes weren't just about feeding the population. Granaries underpinned the entire economy. The state used them to pay soldiers, temple workers, and laborers building monuments. Foreign rulers received shipments of Egyptian grain as tribute or diplomatic gifts. Even political revolts could hinge on the availability, or lack, of stored food. A poorly stocked granary could mean riots in the streets. A well-stocked one could mean peace. As you follow a group of workers deeper into the granary complex, you pass rooms sealed long ago, their mud-plastered entrances still bearing the intact seal of an official dead for centuries. Inside, the grain sits quietly in the dark, the stored sunlight of past summers waiting to become bread, beer, or currency. Archaeologists have actually found ancient stores like these, their contents carbonized but still recognizable after thousands of years. One excavated granary in Thebes even contained remnants of rodent nests, a small reminder that, despite humanity's best efforts, nature always finds a way to sneak a taste. And there's a quirky little detail about some of these storage spaces: they often doubled as archives. Scribes sometimes tucked copies of grain records, tax receipts, or temple inventories into the walls themselves, sealing them in alongside the grain. It's possible this was a practical choice, keeping records close to the goods they described, or maybe it was a form of ritual protection, ensuring that the gods themselves were witness to the counts. Either way, it's thanks to these hidden documents that modern historians can reconstruct the staggering scale of Egypt's storage system. You stop before one of the larger chambers and rest a hand on its cool mud brick wall. Inside lies months of labor. The sowing, the harvesting, the threshing, the measuring, all transformed into something that can endure. It's humbling in a way. Each chamber is a time capsule, storing not just grain, but the hopes and fears of the people who filled it. Will the next flood be generous? Will the gods be kind? Will the people thrive or starve? The answers to those questions are, quite literally, sealed inside. As the sun dips low over the desert horizon, casting the granaries in long, slanting shadows, you realize that these humble, dusty buildings are as vital to Egypt's greatness as its temples and tombs. The pyramids might make the headlines, but the granaries kept the workers alive long enough to build them. They are monuments of a different kind, not to kings or gods, but to planning, patience, and the quiet genius of human ingenuity. Tomorrow, the grain will begin its journey again, distributed to temples, collected as taxes, or delivered as payment. But tonight, it rests. And in that stillness, those sealed mud brick chambers hold more than grain. They hold Egypt's future. The granaries stand silent now, their sealed chambers bulging with the wealth of the Nile. But you know, and every farmer knows, that not all of that grain will stay here. A significant portion is destined for someone far more powerful than any peasant or village scribe. because once the harvest is tallied and stored, the next great ritual of the agricultural year begins, paying the grain tax. And this is not a small matter. It is the engine that keeps the pharaoh's kingdom turning. You start early, before the heat turns the air to liquid, and join the long, winding line of farmers snaking its way toward the local administrative compound. Each of you carries your dues: baskets of emmer, sacks of barley, sometimes even jars of beer brewed from surplus grain. The scene is almost festive, in a resigned kind of way. Children chase chickens between the legs of waiting farmers, neighbors grumble quietly about last year's rates, and vendors sell cheap figs and watered wine to the queuing crowd. But beneath the chatter is a shared tension. This is the day when the state comes calling, and no one wants to come up short. At the head of the line stands a raised platform, shaded by a canopy of woven reeds. There, the officials await: a tax inspector, a temple representative, a pair of muscular guards who look far too cheerful about their jobs, and, of course, a scribe with his ever-present palette and scroll. The process is simple in theory. You step forward, present your grain, have it measured and recorded, and receive a clay receipt stamped with the royal seal. In reality, though, the process is anything but simple. The inspector eyes your basket skeptically, lifting a handful of grain and letting it trickle through his fingers. He consults the scribe, who cross-references your name with the records from the last flood season. Then comes the verdict. Your field produced more this year than expected, so the tax has increased accordingly. You sigh. You suspected as much. Pharaoh doesn't just tax what you bring, he taxes what he thinks you could have brought. And arguing with the state is, historically speaking, a losing strategy. Here's a mainstream fact wasn't some occasional inconvenience. It was the backbone of Egypt's economy. It funded the temples, fed the royal court, paid soldiers, and supplied massive construction projects. The workforce that built the pyramids and carved the temples of Karnak didn't receive silver coins. They received rations of grain, beer, and oil, all of it collected through this very system. Without the annual tax, none of Egypt's monumental achievements would have been possible. But the process was more than economic. It was ceremonial. Officials often invoked the gods as justification for the levy. Part of your grain went to the temples as offerings to Osiris or Renenutet, another part to the state as tribute to the divine pharaoh. In theory, this wasn't just payment, it was a sacred duty. By surrendering a share of your harvest, you were helping maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance of order and harmony. It's a little easier to swallow when you think of it as supporting the universe rather than paying a tax bill. There's a quirky tidbit buried in some administrative texts. Occasionally, temples would send priests to bless the tax grain as it was handed over, sprinkling it with water from the Nile and chanting prayers to ensure the next harvest would be just as bountiful. It was probably more about softening the blow than actual divine intervention, but hey, free blessings never hurt. As you shuffle forward in line, you overhear murmurs from the farmers ahead. One man swears the inspector is skimming off the top for himself. Another complains that the flood was too low this year and the tax is unfair. They're not wrong. The system could be harsh. Because tax obligations were often fixed in advance, a poor harvest didn't necessarily mean lower taxes. Families might have to dip into their personal stores or borrow from neighbors just to meet their quota. And if they couldn't, penalties ranged from fines and confiscation to forced labor. There are even records of people being sold into servitude to repay tax debts. Historians still argue whether this system was fundamentally exploitative or simply the price of sustaining a complex state. Some see it as an early form of wealth redistribution, a way to pool resources for public works and national stability. Others view it as the foundation of Egypt's rigid class hierarchy, where the labor of many supported the luxury of a few. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. When it's finally your turn, the process moves quickly. The scribe notes your name, field size, and delivery. The inspector measures the grain with a standard heqat jar, then dumps it into a large communal bin destined for transport. A clay tablet is pressed into your hand, embossed with the royal seal, proof that you've paid your dues this season. It's both a receipt and a shield. Without it, any official could accuse you of tax evasion, and that's not a conversation you want to have. Of course, the state's appetite isn't the only one you have to feed. Temples often collect their own dues, separate from royal taxes, and village leaders may request additional contributions for local projects. By the time everyone has taken their cut, you might be left with significantly less grain than you harvested. It's no wonder ancient Egyptians placed such emphasis on abundant floods and careful storage. There was never such a thing as too much grain. As the sun climbs higher, the collected tax grain is loaded onto ox-drawn carts and hauled away. Some will travel down the Nile to the capital, where it will feed soldiers, scribes, and priests. Some will be delivered to massive temple complexes, fueling endless offerings and festivals. And some will simply vanish into the labyrinthine machinery of the state, repurposed and redistributed in ways no farmer will ever fully understand. You watch the carts roll away and feel a mix of relief and resignation. The burden of the tax is heavy, but it is also the price of living under Egypt's ordered, powerful state. And deep down, you know that this system, for all its flaws, is part of why your civilization thrives while others falter. It keeps the temples open, the soldiers marching, the scribes writing, and the pharaoh's will stretching from the delta to the Nubian frontier. Before you leave, you pass a small shrine near the edge of the compound. Someone has left an offering of bread and beer there, perhaps a plea for a kinder tax season next year, or a thank you for having survived this one. You smile. It's a humble gesture, but a deeply human one. Grain might be counted in heqats and cars, but its true value is measured in the lives it sustains. And so, with the tax delivered and the state's claim satisfied, you return home. Your granary is smaller now, but still full enough to see you through the year. And in the back of your mind, a familiar rhythm is already forming. Because when the next flood comes, the whole cycle will begin again. Sowing, harvesting, threshing, measuring, and once more, lining up to pay tribute to the gods and the pharaoh alike. For now, though, the season's heaviest burden has lifted. Tomorrow, the scribes will move on to the next village. The officials will tally their totals, and the collected grain will begin its long journey through Egypt's vast bureaucratic arteries. But tonight, as you sit by your hearth and break bread with your family, you can rest knowing that your duty is done, at least until the Nile rises again. The line is gone now. The farmers have trudged home, the guards are leaning in the shade, and the tax grain sits in neat, measured heaps awaiting transport. But before even a single basket moves from this compound, one final and crucial layer of control clicks into place, and that layer is bureaucracy. If the tax ritual was about gathering the state's lifeblood, this part is about making sure none of it ever goes missing. And that, my sleepy friend, is where scribes and seals step onto the stage. You step back into the shade of the administrative building, and there he is, a man hunched over a low wooden table, palette and papyrus at the ready, lips pursed in deep concentration. His fingers are stained with ink, his head shaved for hygiene, or perhaps to keep lice from eating the state's paperwork, and his reed pen dances like a conductor's baton. Meet the scribe, the quiet powerhouse of pharaonic Egypt. Without him, the entire machinery of grain storage, taxation, and distribution would grind to a halt. It might surprise you that literacy was rare in ancient Egypt. Fewer than 1% of people could read or write, and those who could were considered elite specialists. Scribes were trained from childhood, memorizing hieroglyphs, hieratic shorthand, and complex systems of accounting. By the time they took up posts in a granary or temple, they weren't just clerks, they were gatekeepers of the kingdom's knowledge, and, by extension, its power. You watch as the scribe dips his pen into a small cake of carbon black ink and carefully records each farmer's name, field size, and tax payment. Every single basket of grain is tallied, cross-referenced, and inscribed. It's a tedious, mind-numbing task, but it's also the foundation of a system that's been running for over 1,000 years. The grain collected today will be tracked not only through this season, but possibly for decades, because some of it will sit in storage as part of long-term reserves. Here's a mainstream fact worth noting. Egyptian bureaucrats were meticulous record keepers. Entire papyrus archives have survived, documenting how much grain was stored, where it came from, and where it was destined to go. These records even included notations about spoilage, theft, and weather conditions. The precision is astonishing. It's like looking at ancient Excel spreadsheets, minus the accidental deletion of column D. But scribes weren't the only ones guarding the granaries. Once the grain was measured and recorded, another layer of security came into play: sealing. Massive storage rooms were often fitted with heavy wooden doors or clay-plastered entryways. After the officials inspected the contents, they would press a lump of wet clay over the closure and stamp it with an official seal, often a carved stone cylinder rolled across the surface, leaving an intricate impression of royal names, administrative offices, or temple symbols. This wasn't just a practical measure, it was a statement. A seal meant that the contents inside were now the property of the state, and tampering with them was a serious crime. Break a seal without authorization, and you could find yourself facing severe punishment, from hefty fines to forced labor, and, in particularly bad cases, a one-way trip to the afterlife courtesy of the pharaoh's justice system. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, inspectors would place tiny clay seals on individual sacks or baskets, not just the main storage room. It might seem excessive, like putting a padlock on every single cupboard in your kitchen, but it was an effective deterrent against theft by workers or officials themselves. In fact, archaeologists have found hundreds of broken seal impressions discarded near ancient storehouses, evidence of centuries of careful oversight. As you wander deeper into the granary complex, you notice more scribes at work. Some are tallying outgoing shipments, others preparing transport manifests. One young apprentice struggles with a tricky column of numbers, muttering under his breath about heqats and cars. It's a reminder that measuring grain wasn't just about weight, it was about volume, density, and even moisture content. Too dry, and the grain might crumble. Too damp, and it might rot before it ever reached its destination. Accurate records weren't just bureaucratic fussiness, they were essential to keeping Egypt's food supply stable. Historians still argue whether scribes wielded more real power than soldiers or priests. On one hand, they rarely held weapons or commanded temples. On the other, nothing, and I mean nothing, happened in Egypt without their inked approval. Grain couldn't be stored, moved, or distributed without documentation. Taxes couldn't be enforced without records. Even temple rituals depended on scribed lists of offerings and inventory logs. Some scholars even call them the hidden elite, a bureaucratic class that quietly held the kingdom together from behind their writing desks. And yet, for all their importance, scribes weren't always loved. Farmers sometimes resented them, viewing their tallies as cold and unforgiving. Officials feared them, knowing that one unfavorable entry in a scroll could ruin a career. And occasionally, even the pharaoh had to negotiate with the bureaucracy's slow, ink-stained gears. There's an old Egyptian saying, half joke, half warning, that a bad harvest is better than an angry scribe. Back near the main storeroom, a final group of officials moves among the sealed doors. Each seal is inspected, cataloged, and marked with the date and the name of the inspector. Some even receive secondary seals from temple representatives, a double verification system that ensured no one could later claim ignorance if something went missing. It's almost comical how much energy goes into making sure grain doesn't mysteriously vanish. Then again, considering that thousands of lives depend on it, the caution makes sense. One of the most fascinating aspects of this bureaucracy is how it blurred the line between religion and administration. Many granaries were technically under temple control, even if they supplied state projects. Temple scribes and royal scribes often worked side by side, each answering to different authorities but sharing the same dusty storerooms. In some periods, temples even issued their own sealed receipts, effectively acting as banks where grain could be deposited, borrowed, or exchanged. It's an early hint at the economic complexity Egypt would one day achieve. And there's one more layer of intrigue: forgery. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, counterfeit seals and falsified records were a problem. Some clever or desperate individuals learned to carve imitation seals or bribe scribes to adjust totals in their favor. Archaeologists have uncovered suspiciously altered records and mismatched seal impressions, the ancient equivalent of cooking the books. The state took such offenses very seriously, and punishment was swift and severe. But the fact that people tried shows just how valuable a few extra sacks of grain could be. As the sun dips lower and the bureaucrats finish their day's work, the granary complex transforms. What was once a noisy hub of activity is now a fortress of order. Doors sealed, records rolled and stored, guards posted at the entrances. Tomorrow, some of this grain will begin its journey downriver, bound for distant temples, garrisons, and building sites. But for tonight, it rests safely behind stamped clay and carefully inked scrolls. You glance one last time at the scribe, now stretching his cramped fingers and blowing gently on his final line of text to dry the ink. He's been at this table since dawn, his mind navigating a labyrinth of numbers and names. And yet, in this quiet, methodical work lies the heartbeat of an empire. Because grain isn't just food. It's tax revenue, wages, currency, and political power all rolled into one. And without scribes and seals, all of it would scatter like chaff in the wind. The bureaucracy might feel dull and lifeless to some, endless rows of numbers and clay stamps, but in reality, it is the invisible glue holding everything together. Pharaoh's power, temple wealth, army rations, and even the next season's planting all depend on the steady hands of men like this. And as you step back out into the cooling evening, you realize that this web of ink and clay is as essential to Egypt's greatness as the Nile itself. You'd think that once the grain is harvested, threshed, measured, taxed, logged, sealed, and tucked away in those massive mud brick granaries, the story would calm down. But oh no! Because if there's one thing ancient Egyptians understood painfully well, it's that grain never rests. It might look peaceful, piled in the darkness of a cool storeroom, but the moment the human threat is locked out, another army creeps in. Pests. Tiny, hungry, relentless pests. You step into one of the granaries, and the first thing that hits you isn't the scent of grain. It's the faint, musky smell of life. Something is alive in here, and it's not supposed to be. Ancient Egyptians, like farmers everywhere, lived in constant battle with the natural enemies of stored food. Rodents, insects, mold, and even birds had a knack for finding their way inside, and each could ruin months of back-breaking work in a matter of weeks. The worst offenders? Mice and rats. Small, furry, and armed with teeth sharp enough to gnaw through reed baskets, they were the scourge of storage sites along the Nile. Once inside, they didn't just eat the grain, they contaminated it with droppings and urine, rendering whole batches unfit for consumption. To the Egyptians, who depended on these stores to survive dry seasons and bad floods, a rodent infestation wasn't a nuisance, it was a crisis. So they fought back, with impressive ingenuity. Granaries were often built with raised floors and smooth plastered walls to make climbing more difficult. Some even featured small moats or ditches filled with water around the base of storage platforms, creating tiny rat-proof islands where baskets were kept. And of course, Cats, the unofficial mascots of Egyptian households, played a starring role. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians were among the first societies to domesticate cats, not just for companionship, but specifically for pest control. Archaeological evidence shows that cats were kept near granaries as early as the Middle Kingdom, circa 2000 BCE, where they patrolled storage sites like silent, whiskered security guards. And because they were so effective, they quickly earned sacred status, associated with the goddess Bastet. You could say cats weren't just pets, they were divine exterminators. Still, not every threat could be handled by feline enforcement. Insects, for instance, were far trickier. Weevils, moth larvae, and beetles could burrow deep into stored grain, multiplying rapidly and ruining vast quantities before anyone even noticed. Ancient Egyptians had no insecticides, of course, but they weren't helpless. One technique involved periodically turning and airing out the grain, exposing larvae to sunlight and drying conditions that would kill them. Another involved mixing the grain with dried herbs or ashes, a kind of ancient bug repellent. Here's a quirky tidbit. There's evidence that Egyptians sometimes stored grain alongside aromatic plants like thyme or mint, not just for the pleasant smell, but because the oils repelled pests. Think of it as the ancient version of lavender sachets in your closet, except instead of saving your sweaters, it was saving your civilization's food supply. Larger predators pose their own challenges. Snakes and lizards, for example, were drawn to granaries because of the rodent buffet. While some Egyptians welcomed these natural hunters, a snake that eats mice is a friend after all, others saw them as dangerous intruders. To deter them, granaries were often sealed with tightly fitted doors and carefully packed mud brick walls with no gaps or crevices. Even so, stories abound of snakes slithering into storage rooms. One papyrus account mentions a particularly bold cobra that took up residence in a temple granary, inspiring both fear and superstition among the workers. Historians still argue whether these pest control strategies were primarily practical or had religious undertones. Some scholars believe that protective rituals, like placing small amulets at granary entrances or painting images of cats and snakes on storage walls, were meant as literal pest deterrents. Others argue they were symbolic, intended to invoke divine protection rather than actually scare off vermin. Either way, it shows how seriously Egyptians took the threat. And pests weren't the only worry. Moisture, mold, and rot could devastate a storage room just as quickly as any rodent. Grain had to be stored at the right dryness level. Too damp, and it spoiled. Too dry, and it became brittle and useless. To manage this, workers sometimes dried the grain in the sun before storage and used clay-lined silos that absorbed excess moisture. Some granaries even had small ventilation shafts to allow airflow, a clever passive system that kept humidity at bay. You might assume that once the grain was sealed away, the pests stayed out. But sometimes the greatest threat came from inside, literally. Rats or insects could infest the grain before it was stored, meaning they were sealed in along with the food. This is why careful inspection before storage was crucial. Workers would sift and sort the grain, removing damaged kernels and signs of infestation before sealing the chambers. It was tedious work, but it could mean the difference between a storehouse full of food and a useless, rotting mess. And then there's the human factor, the so-called two-legged pests. Theft from granaries was a serious problem, especially during lean years. Hungry villagers, corrupt officials, or even desperate workers might attempt to sneak grain out under the cover of night. In response, granaries were guarded, often by armed watchmen who patrolled the storage sites. In some larger state complexes, records show multiple layers of oversight. One group managed the grain, another recorded its movement, and a third ensured the first two weren't skimming off the top. Ancient bureaucracy, the gift that keeps on giving. Occasionally, the Egyptians employed more creative deterrents. In one region, archaeologists found evidence that granary walls had been painted with images of protective deities: jackal-headed Anubis, lion-headed Sekhmet, perhaps to scare away both rodents and would-be thieves. And yes, there are even accounts of live snakes being deliberately introduced into storage sites to patrol for pests. Imagine that! You open a granary door and there's a cobra coiled next to your barley. Pest control and a heart attack in one convenient package. The stakes were high enough to justify such extremes. A major infestation or a batch lost to rot could mean starvation during a poor flood year. It wasn't just a matter of losing food, it was a matter of losing political stability. Grain shortages could lead to unrest, rebellion, or the weakening of state authority. Pharaoh's power wasn't built on gold or soldiers alone, it was built on full bellies. And so, night after night, the battle continued. Cats prowled silently along granary walls. Watchmen paced with spears under the moonlight. Workers checked seals by torchlight, listening for the telltale rustle of tiny feet. It was a constant war, waged grain by grain, against enemies you could barely see, but could never ignore. As you stand in the dim, cool air of the storage chamber, you notice a small clay figure tucked into a corner, a cat with arched back and raised paw. It's a simple charm, maybe placed by a worker centuries ago, maybe just for luck. But it's also a reminder that for all the engineering and bureaucracy, success here ultimately came down to vigilance. Grain wasn't just harvested and stored, it had to be defended. And when the Nile failed to flood, or a locust swarm stripped the fields bare, those defended stores became more than just food. They became the thin, fragile line between life and death for thousands of people. In that sense, the battle against pests wasn't just about saving grain, it was about saving civilization itself. The grain sits safely now, dried, sealed, guarded, and recorded. It has survived the trials of harvest, tax, and pest, resting in its cool mud brick chambers like a sleeping giant. But grain in Egypt was never meant to simply sit still. It had a far more dynamic role to play in the life of the kingdom, one that reached far beyond storage and survival. Because in ancient Egypt, grain wasn't just food, it was currency. You step out into the bustling courtyard of a temple storehouse on a market day, and the scene is a living demonstration of that truth. Carts creak under the weight of grain sacks. Priests negotiate with traders over bushels of emmer, and in the shade of a tall sycamore, a group of workers sit cross-legged, accepting payment for their labor, not in coins, not in gold, but in carefully measured portions of grain. It's easy to forget that for much of Egypt's long history, minted money simply didn't exist. Trade and payment relied instead on barter and, most importantly, on standardized units of agricultural goods. Grain was the obvious choice. It was universally needed, easy to measure, and relatively stable in value. When a mason built a wall, he might receive a few sacks of barley. When a sailor ferried goods up the Nile, he'd be paid in wheat. Even priests, scribes, and government officials received their wages in grain rations. Here's a mainstream fact. During the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the state maintained a complex system of wage distribution that was almost entirely grain-based. Records from Deir el-Medina, a village of tomb builders working on royal projects, show that workers received monthly rations of grain, beer, and oil, all meticulously recorded and delivered. These weren't payments in the modern sense, they were sustenance, the literal calories that powered Egypt's workforce. And grain wages weren't just a practical choice, they were a deeply symbolic one. Grain was life. It flowed from the Nile's bounty, nurtured the people, and sustained the gods themselves through temple offerings. To receive grain as payment was to participate directly in the natural and divine cycles that structured Egyptian society. Gold was pretty, sure, but you couldn't eat it. Grain, on the other hand, kept your family alive. In the busy courtyard, you notice another type of transaction unfolding. A farmer approaches a craftsman carrying a small basket of barley. In exchange for the grain, the craftsman agrees to repair the farmer's plow. No scribe is present, no contract is written, just a simple exchange of value, a microcosm of Egypt's informal economy. This was common, especially in rural areas, where grain served as a kind of universal barter token. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Egyptians even used bread and beer, both made from grain, as currency in everyday trade. Bakers would accept a set amount of grain as payment for loaves, which could then be used to barter for other goods. Beer, often considered safer to drink than water, became a kind of liquid money in itself. There's a famous example from worksite records where a laborer's daily wage was described not as so many heqats of grain, but as 4 loaves and 2 jugs. This grain-based economy extended into some surprisingly sophisticated financial practices. Temples and state granaries often acted as banks, storing surplus grain and issuing receipts, small clay tokens or written documents that could be exchanged later for actual goods. These receipts could change hands multiple times before anyone ever withdrew the grain, functioning much like promissory notes or early currency. Imagine walking into a temple, depositing your surplus barley, and leaving with a clay tablet you could later trade for a pair of sandals. That was ancient Egyptian finance in action. Historians still argue whether this system counts as money in the strict sense. Some argue that without coins or a universal medium of exchange, it's more accurate to call it a barter economy. Others contend that the grain receipts and standard measurements functioned exactly like currency, just without metal coins. The debate might sound academic, but it highlights how advanced and flexible Egypt's economic system really was. Payment in grain wasn't limited to workers and tradesmen. It reached deep into the heart of state power. Soldiers on campaign were often paid in grain rations, ensuring they remained loyal and well-fed far from home. Priests received grain as part of their temple duties, which they could use to support their families or trade for luxury goods. Even foreign mercenaries hired by the pharaoh were sometimes compensated with Egyptian grain, which they could sell or trade when they returned home. And then there were the monumental state projects, the temples, obelisks, and tombs that still dominate the desert skyline today. These weren't built by enslaved masses chained to stone blocks, as popular myth often suggests. They were built by skilled laborers, stonemasons, carpenters, and haulers, all of whom were fed and paid through a carefully managed grain economy. The massive surplus collected during harvest season was converted into rations, distributed at work sites, and even used to reward exceptional performance. A foreman might receive a double portion for finishing ahead of schedule, while a team that slacked off could see its ration cut. In many ways, this system tied everyone, from peasant farmer to royal architect, into a single interconnected web. Your grain, once harvested and taxed, might go to feed the workers building a new temple hundreds of miles away. Or it might be traded to foreign merchants for cedarwood, copper, or lapis lazuli. It might even be used to pay tribute to a neighboring kingdom, buying peace without spilling a drop of blood. Grain wasn't just wealth, it was influence. Of course, where there's value, there's also exploitation. Officials in charge of grain distribution wielded immense power. A generous scribe could make a friend for life with a little extra wheat. A corrupt one could starve a village by misplacing a few shipments. Grain shortages could quickly become political crises, leading to riots or rebellions. In one notable incident during the New Kingdom, a work crew at Deir el-Medina famously went on strike, one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history, because their grain rations were late. Imagine the pharaoh's embarrassment, the builders of his tomb refusing to work because their bread delivery was behind schedule. And yet, for all its imperfections, the system worked astonishingly well. It allowed Egypt to mobilize labor on a massive scale, support a complex bureaucracy, and project its power far beyond its borders, all without ever striking a coin. In a world where wealth was often measured in shiny metal, Egypt built its empire on sacks of emmer and barley. As you watch the sun set over the courtyard, the day's transactions wind down. Workers shoulder their rations and head home. Priests tally offerings for tomorrow's ceremonies. Traders load grain onto small riverboats bound for distant markets. And in the cool shadows of the temple, scribes roll up papyrus scrolls filled with the day's figures, a silent ledger of the kingdom's heartbeat. It's humbling to realize that something as simple and humble as a grain kernel, the same thing you crush between your teeth in every loaf of bread, once underpinned the entire machinery of one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Gold may have glittered in the pharaoh's tomb, but grain kept the lights on, the workers fed, and the gods appeased. So, as you brush a handful of kernels through your fingers, feel the weight of it, not in grams or ounces, but in lives sustained, temples built, armies paid, and histories written. Because here along the Nile, wealth isn't counted in coins, it's measured in harvests. When the harvest was good and the granaries were full, the people of Egypt did not see their abundance as merely human achievement. The bounty was a gift from the gods, a sacred reward for piety and order. And so, part of that grain, once measured and stored, did not feed bellies or pay wages. It was destined for a higher purpose, to nourish the divine, to fuel the rituals that kept the universe in balance, and to sustain the magnificent temple life that defined Egyptian religion. Step with me now into the temple precincts, not the towering sanctuaries where priests chant and incense swirls, but the quieter, lesser-seen spaces behind them, the temple storehouses. These buildings, often vast and labyrinthine, were the economic heart of Egyptian religion. Their thick mud brick walls held not gold or silver, but something more essential: sacks of barley, jars of beer, amphorae of oil, bundles of flax, and endless stacks of bread. At first glance, these storehouses might seem merely practical, a way to keep offerings organized, but they were much more. In the Egyptian worldview, the gods required daily sustenance just as humans did. Statues of Amun, Ra, Hathor, and Osiris ate meals several times a day. Not literally, of course, but symbolically, through elaborate offerings that maintained Ma'at, cosmic order. Without these offerings, the gods might grow displeased, the Nile might fail to flood, and the world itself could fall into chaos. Every morning, before the temple gates opened to the public, a small army of priests, servants, and workers prepared the divine breakfast. They brought trays piled high with fresh bread and cakes, jars of beer, cuts of meat, baskets of vegetables, and bowls of fruit. Central to all of it was grain, the base from which most offerings were made. Bread and beer were considered the staple gifts, and their preparation was a sacred duty. Here's a fascinating detail. Many temples had their own bakeries and breweries on site, staffed by temple workers who specialized in producing ritual-grade food. These were not ordinary loaves or common beer. They were crafted according to strict ritual standards, often with prayers spoken over each batch. The grain for these offerings came directly from the temple storehouses, where it was carefully measured and accounted for by scribes. Once the offerings were presented to the gods, they were considered imbued with divine essence, too sacred to be wasted. After the rituals concluded, the food was removed from the sanctuary and redistributed. Some went to the priests, who consumed it as part of their payment. Some was given to temple workers or shared among the poor. In this way, the gods' table nourished not only divine order, but also the human community that served them. But temple storehouses were more than just pantries for divine meals. They were also vital centers of social and economic life. Temples were among the largest landowners in Egypt, controlling vast estates that produced enormous quantities of grain, oil, wine, and livestock. All of this flowed into the temple granaries, where it was processed, stored, and redistributed. This wealth gave temples tremendous power. A major temple, like the Great House of Amun at Karnak, was essentially a state within a state, complete with its own workforce, administration, transport system, and economy. Grain from temple storehouses paid thousands of workers, maintained fleets of boats, and even funded construction projects. In times of famine, temples sometimes distributed grain to the people, acting as a kind of emergency relief system. And then there were the festivals, grand, spectacular celebrations that punctuated the Egyptian calendar. Many of these events lasted several days or even weeks, drawing crowds from miles around. At the center of every festival was food, and once again, the temple storehouses provided. Take, for example, the beautiful Festival of the Valley in Thebes. During this annual celebration, the god Amun statue was carried across the Nile to visit the necropolis. Families gathered in the cemeteries for feasts, offerings, and remembrance. The temples distributed bread and beer to the crowds, creating an atmosphere of abundance and joy. These weren't small handouts, they were massive logistical undertakings, requiring months of planning and mountains of stored grain. Or consider the Great Opet Festival, also in Thebes, where Amun's statue traveled from Karnak to Luxor amid music, dancing, and offerings. The temple kitchens worked around the clock, baking thousands of loaves and brewing vast quantities of beer for priests, dignitaries, and ordinary celebrants alike. Without the temple storehouses and their careful management of grain, such celebrations would have been impossible. There's a deeper significance here, beyond logistics. These festivals weren't just parties, they were cosmic renewals, reenactments of divine stories, and reaffirmations of Egypt's harmony with the gods. By sharing food with the people, the temple symbolized the gods' generosity and ensured that Ma'at extended beyond the sanctuary into everyday life. Grain, humble, earthy, grown from the Nile's gift, was the medium through which divine grace became tangible. Of course, temple storehouses weren't immune to corruption or abuse. Because they controlled vast amounts of wealth, they attracted ambition and greed. There are records of priests skimming grain from offerings, administrators falsifying inventories, or officials using temple grain for personal gain. In some periods, temples became so wealthy and powerful that pharaohs tried to limit their control over land and harvests. Yet even these conflicts reveal just how central temple storehouses were to Egypt's political and economic fabric. The intertwining of religion, economy, and daily life meant that grain's journey, from field to granary to altar, was never just about food. It was about relationship between people and gods, rulers and subjects, the living and the dead. A loaf of bread placed before a statue wasn't merely sustenance, it was a message. We remember, we are grateful, keep the river flowing. Even in death, grain offerings remained essential. Tombs were stocked with bread and beer to feed the soul in the afterlife. Temples often managed these funerary offerings too, ensuring that the dead were remembered and nourished for eternity. Once again, the temple storehouses were the link, the place where human labor, divine will, and cosmic balance converged. By the time you leave the temple precinct, the sun is high, and the courtyard is alive with activity. Workers carry baskets of grain into the cool storerooms, scribes tally incoming shipments, and bakers shovel fresh loaves into clay ovens. It's easy to be awed by the towering pylons and colossal statues of the gods. But in truth, the real power of the temple is here, in the measured hum of daily work, in the ceaseless movement of grain, and in the quiet conviction that feeding the gods is how the world continues to turn. And so, the storehouses stand, part pantry, part treasury, part bridge between heaven and earth. Their walls do not glitter with gold, but they hold something far more valuable, the sustenance of gods and men alike, the raw material of ritual and celebration, the grain that keeps Ma'at alive. In the end, perhaps the ancient Egyptians understood something we too often forget, that the divine isn't always found in the extraordinary. Sometimes it's hidden in the most ordinary things. A loaf of bread, a jar of beer, a humble kernel of grain, offered with reverence to the eternal. Even with granaries stocked and temple storehouses brimming, life along the Nile was never entirely predictable. The river, source of Egypt's incredible agricultural wealth, was also capricious. One year, it might rise generously, leaving behind a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt. The next, it could barely trickle, leaving fields parched and cracked. For farmers, scribes, and officials alike, this uncertainty was a constant undercurrent, a reminder that grain, no matter how carefully stored, was always at the mercy of the elements. You stroll along the riverbank, watching the water lapping gently at the reeds, and imagine the anxiety of earlier generations. Before the rise of massive state granaries, a poor flood meant hunger. Families relied solely on what they could store in small bins or sacks, and a failed harvest could be catastrophic. Grain wasn't just food, it was survival. The Nile's rhythms dictated when you planted, when you harvested, and how much you could spare for storage. And because the floods could vary so dramatically from year to year, planning for both abundance and scarcity became an essential skill. Ancient Egyptians developed remarkably sophisticated strategies to cope with these fluctuations. They used long-term records, often inscribed on papyrus, to track flood levels, field yields, and annual grain production. Officials would consult these records to determine how much grain to reserve, how much to distribute to temple and state projects, and how much could be set aside for emergency reserves. These calculations were not casual guesses. They were careful, mathematical predictions aimed at balancing human need with divine favor. Here's a mainstream fact. The Egyptians measured grain with units such as the heqat, approximately 4.8 liters, and kar, about 76 liters. These measures were standardized, allowing officials to compare yields year by year, village by village. This data informed everything from tax rates to storage strategies. A low flood might trigger rationing. A surplus could allow expansion of state projects or additional temple offerings. It was a system of checks and balances built on the simple kernel of grain. But managing uncertainty was not only about math. People also relied on cultural and religious practices to predict and mitigate the Nile's behavior. Priests performed rituals and made offerings to Hapi, the god of the inundation, hoping to secure a favorable flood. Farmers observed the sky, the behavior of birds, and even the patterns of insects in their fields as informal indicators of water levels to come. While modern science might dismiss these signs as superstition, they often reflected centuries of careful observation, a kind of proto-meteorology. Some communities buried clay models of boats or grain jars along their fields, offering them as symbolic insurance policies to the river gods. They believed that by giving these miniature tributes, they could ensure enough water and grain for the coming year. From a practical perspective, these rituals also reinforced social cohesion, reminding everyone in the village of shared risk and responsibility. The state, of course, had to think even bigger. Pharaohs and temple administrators didn't just worry about individual families, they worried about feeding entire cities, maintaining armies, and supporting the vast bureaucracy that ran the kingdom. A failed harvest could trigger political instability as quickly as famine. Granaries, temple storehouses, and carefully maintained records became tools for resilience. They weren't just storage units, they were part of a nationwide safety net designed to smooth out the Nile's unpredictable moods. This system also encouraged surplus production. When floods were generous, farmers often harvested more than they immediately needed. Some of this surplus was used to pay additional taxes or temple offerings, but a significant portion was stored for future shortages. The careful rotation of grain, moving it from temporary storage to long-term granaries, allowed the state to maintain a buffer stock capable of sustaining the population through lean years. In essence, Egypt's storage infrastructure transformed abundance into security, turning the river's generosity into a reliable resource. Historians still argue whether these strategies were entirely preemptive or more reactive. Some scholars suggest that early granary systems were primarily about storing enough to survive occasional shortages, while others argue they were proactive instruments of statecraft, enabling the pharaoh to manipulate resources to maintain political and religious control. Either way, the evidence shows that Egyptians were acutely aware of the stakes and invested heavily in managing uncertainty. Even within individual communities, the tension between surplus and scarcity influenced daily life. Farmers might save the best grain for their own families, use a portion for barter, and submit the rest to the tax authorities. Village leaders often organized communal granaries, pooling resources to ensure that no household suffered catastrophic loss. And in particularly dry years, these local reserves could mean the difference between starvation and survival. It wasn't just a practical exercise, it was also a lesson in patience. Grain stored in clay silos or mud brick chambers could last for months, sometimes even years, if kept dry and secure. Managing this resource required foresight: when to withdraw it, when to distribute it, and when to leave it untouched. For scribes and administrators, making the right call could affect thousands of lives, from the smallest child in a village to the soldiers stationed at distant outposts. You pause by one of the larger state granaries, imagining the delicate calculations behind its fully loaded chambers. Workers have arranged the sacks in precise stacks, the top layer sealed with fresh clay. Scribes walk the aisles, counting, recording, and occasionally opening a basket to inspect the grain's condition. Cats slink between the piles, ever vigilant against rodents. Even in this calm moment, the tension of potential drought is palpable. Every sack represents months of labor, human hope, and the kingdom's survival strategy. And then there's the human drama of decision-making during surplus and shortage. Officials had to decide whether to release grain early to stabilize local markets, hold it for future famine, or divert it to ambitious construction projects. A misstep could inflame discontent, depress the local economy, or provoke unrest. It was a delicate balance, one that required an understanding of both human behavior and the unpredictable Nile. Quirky fact: some temple records describe grain being redistributed in the form of bread or beer as temporary relief during minor shortages. This was both practical and ceremonial. Feeding the people in the name of the gods reinforced social cohesion while ensuring the food was consumed in a controlled manner. It's a clever blend of governance, religion, and psychology. Provide sustenance, maintain loyalty, and subtly remind everyone who's in charge. By the end of the day, the riverbank is quiet. The granaries stand tall and immobile, and the scribes have tucked their records away. But the work of planning for drought and surplus continues invisibly. In the calculations of officials, in the careful inspection of stored grain, in the anticipatory prayers to Hapi, and in the collective memory of generations who have learned to respect, fear, and depend upon the Nile's rhythms. For you, standing among the silent sacks of emmer and barley, it is a humbling lesson. Civilization, no matter how grand, depends on preparation, foresight, and patience. Every kernel of grain is more than food. It is hope stored in mud brick, a lifeline for the future, and a testament to human ingenuity in the face of nature's uncertainties. By now, you've seen how grain moves from field to granary, from tax collection to temple storehouses, and how it underpins life in ancient Egypt. But all of this depends on one deceptively simple question: how much grain do you actually have? Measuring grain in ancient Egypt was far more than a mundane chore. It was a science, an art, and a ritual rolled into one. Every kernel mattered because it represented food, wealth, labor, and divine favor. You find yourself in a quiet corner of a granary, observing an official preparing to measure incoming barley. The tools are humble but effective: a set of clay jars of standardized sizes, some marked with inscriptions to indicate their volume, a simple wooden balance, and a collection of weights. The official dips a scoop into a basket, levels the grain with a flat palm, and pours it into a heqat jar, one of the standard units of measure in Egypt. Precision is critical. Too much, and the state could be cheated. Too little, and you risked underreporting, which could carry severe consequences. Here's a mainstream fact. The Egyptians used several units for grain measurement, the most common being the heqat and the car. One heqat equaled about 4.8 liters, while a car represented 76 liters, roughly 16 heqats. These measures were standardized across the kingdom, which allowed scribes and officials to communicate, calculate taxes, and track grain with remarkable consistency. The system was surprisingly sophisticated given the era and demonstrates the Egyptians' keen understanding of both mathematics and administration. The act of measuring was not just about quantity, it also involved assessing quality. Officials would rub the grain between their fingers, noting any signs of mold, insect damage, or unusual moisture. In some records, you'll see descriptions of perfect grain, moderate, or tainted, and these classifications could influence taxes, storage decisions, and distribution priorities. It was a tactile process, one that required both experience and intuition. In certain regions, scribes would occasionally insert tiny pebbles or straw pieces into their measuring jars as markers to ensure consistency when leveling grain. Think of it as an ancient quality control hack, a simple way to avoid disputes over how full a jar actually was. And disputes did happen, often erupting into heated arguments between farmers and tax collectors because every kernel counted. You notice that measuring grain is also deeply ceremonial. In some temple contexts, the first portion of a batch would be offered to the gods before official calculations began. The grain would be poured into a small offering bowl while prayers were recited. Only after this ritual would the scribe begin recording quantities on papyrus. This intertwining of administration and religion reinforced the idea that measuring grain was not just about logistics, it was about maintaining cosmic order. Historians still argue whether these ceremonial practices were purely symbolic or had practical enforcement functions. Some suggest that rituals helped legitimize the state's control over agricultural wealth, while others propose that they were meant to psychologically encourage honesty and diligence among officials. Either way, they illustrate the unique blend of practicality, spirituality, and governance in Egypt's grain economy. Measuring grain was not always straightforward. Moisture content, for instance, could drastically affect volume and weight. Grain harvested after a particularly humid season might swell, making it appear more abundant than it was. Conversely, overly dry grain could be deceptively light, prompting disputes over the official amount. To account for this, scribes would sometimes adjust quantities based on experience, local climate knowledge, and traditional guidelines. The process also varied depending on the type of grain. Emmer wheat and barley were most common, but other cereals, legumes, or even seeds could be included in state records. Each required slightly different handling and measuring techniques. Some granaries had specialized jars or balances calibrated for different grains, while others relied on general-purpose measures. Despite these differences, consistency across the kingdom remained a top priority, ensuring that taxes, wages, and offerings could be reliably calculated. You can almost imagine a young apprentice scribe learning the ropes. First, he watches the officials carefully, noting the exact movements of the hand when leveling the jar, the subtle differences in texture between grains, and the way the balance tilts under various weights. Then, under supervision, he begins practicing, making small mistakes, correcting them, and slowly internalizing the skill that will allow him to track thousands of bushels in his career. The training could last years, but mastery was essential. A scribe who mismeasured grain could be dismissed or worse. A particularly fascinating aspect of grain measurement was its connection to record keeping and taxation. Once the grain was measured, the scribe would immediately note the quantities on papyrus rolls or clay tablets. These records were then cross-referenced with the farmer's tax obligations, temple offerings, and storage allocations. Accuracy here was paramount. A single error could cascade through the system, disrupting distribution, causing shortages, or inflating taxes unfairly. Quirky Tidbit reportedly memorized complex tables of conversions between heqat, car, and other units without writing them down, essentially becoming human calculators. In a sense, they were living spreadsheets, performing complex computations in their heads long before computers existed. Balancing grain, both literally and figuratively, required vigilance and patience. Officials would check balances daily, recalibrate weights, and sometimes even measure the same batch multiple times to ensure correctness. The combination of tactile skill, careful observation, and meticulous record-keeping made this an exacting profession, one that demanded focus, dexterity, and occasionally a sense of humor to survive the long hours in the dusty granaries. By the time the sun filters through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stacked jars, you realize that measuring grain is more than counting kernels. It's a linchpin of ancient Egyptian civilization, connecting harvest, tax, temple, and economy in a seamless chain. Each heqat measured, each jar leveled, ensures that the state functions smoothly, that temples are fed, that soldiers and workers receive their due, and that society as a whole can thrive despite the uncertainties of the Nile. In the end, it's a lesson in mindfulness. Every kernel counts. Every measurement matters. The simple act of filling a jar with grain, leveling it carefully, and recording the quantity isn't just administration, it is a ritual, a responsibility, and a testament to human ingenuity. And as you step back from the granary, watching scribes and officials continue their tireless work, you understand that the empire's might does not rest solely on monuments or armies, but on the quiet precision of measurement and the stewardship of something as humble as a grain of wheat. By now, you've traced grain from the fields to the granaries through tax collection, storage, temple allocations, and meticulous measurement. But grain's journey doesn't end when it's stacked neatly in clay jars or reed baskets. To fulfill its role as sustenance, currency, and ritual offering, it must move. And in ancient Egypt, movement meant clever engineering, careful planning, and a lot of human muscle. You step onto the edge of the Nile, where the river hums with activity. Boats of all shapes and sizes sway gently in the current, hulls laden with sacks of grain. Some are small enough to be paddled by 2 or 3 men, others large enough to carry tons of cargo downriver to distant markets or temple estates. The Nile is not just a river, it's a highway, the kingdom's central artery through which wealth, food, and information flow. Without it, Egypt's granaries would be static and impotent, locked in place like treasures no one could reach. A mainstream fact, most grain transportation relied heavily on river traffic. Boats were constructed from papyrus reeds for smaller loads or planked wood for heavier cargo. They were powered by oars and sails, taking advantage of the Nile's seasonal winds and currents. During flood season, even inland canals became navigable, creating an extensive network that allowed grain to reach every corner of the kingdom efficiently. You watch as workers carefully load sacks of barley onto a medium-sized boat, balancing them to prevent tipping. Each sack has been measured and sealed, often marked with the official stamp to indicate origin, destination, and quantity. Moving grain isn't just lifting and carrying, it's an exercise in logistics. Too much weight on one side can capsize a vessel, too little care in stacking can crush the lower layers. And unlike modern shipping, there are no forklifts, no pallets, just human labor, animal assistance, and simple mechanical ingenuity like ropes, ramps, and inclined planks. Even over land, grain required careful handling. When carts or sledges transported sacks from field to storage, they often moved slowly, guided by oxen or donkeys. The roads were rudimentary, compacted earth paths that could turn into mud traps during rain. Drivers had to judge weight, friction, and terrain. And in some areas, teams of workers would manually drag sledges up ramps, especially when supplying temple complexes or fortresses built on elevated terrain. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeological evidence suggests that workers sometimes poured water on sand in front of sledges to reduce friction, essentially creating an ancient form of lubrication. It's surprisingly effective, a simple, elegant solution to a practical problem. Imagine dozens of men hauling sacks of barley across the desert, a thin sheen of water under the sledge reducing the strain and preventing disaster. Distribution didn't end with arrival at the destination. Granaries often served as hubs from which grain was rationed or reallocated. In villages, local officials measured out monthly rations to families. Soldiers received their share according to rank and assignment. Temple workers received allocations tied to religious festivals. Even distant construction projects were supplied from centralized hubs, with scribes meticulously recording every heqat transferred. Historians still argue whether the centralized granary system primarily served to prevent famine or to reinforce state control. On one hand, these hubs ensured that no community was left without essential food during lean years. On the other, by controlling the flow of grain, pharaohs and officials could maintain political leverage, reward loyalty, and even quell potential uprisings. The granary was thus both a practical tool and a subtle instrument of governance. Transporting grain also required security. While the river might seem peaceful, theft was always a concern. Guards accompanied shipments, and officials sometimes added additional seals to sacks in transit to discourage tampering. There are records of stolen grain being recovered months later, often with partial documentation still intact, highlighting the Egyptians' commitment to accountability and oversight. You observe the meticulous planning involved in timing these shipments. During harvest, boats move in waves, ensuring that grain reaches markets and temples while still fresh. During lean periods, storage facilities act as buffers, releasing grain slowly to avoid sudden scarcity. Officials maintain a delicate balance, deciding which areas get priority, how much to release, and how to record every movement. It's a logistical ballet, choreographed across hundreds of miles of Nile Valley. Quirky tidbit maintained a rotation system, where the oldest grain was always moved out first to prevent spoilage. Scribes marked the dates on sacks or jars, effectively creating an ancient version of FIFO, first in, first out. It's a reminder that even millennia ago, human ingenuity found solutions to problems we still tackle in modern warehouses. Even the smallest details mattered. Grain destined for temple offerings might be handled differently from that meant for soldiers or workers. Sacks for religious use were often carefully cleaned, sometimes even blessed, to ensure they were suitable for the gods. Meanwhile, bulk shipments for mundane use prioritized efficiency over ceremonial care. The Egyptians understood that the journey of grain wasn't just about transportation, it was about purpose, context, and value. As the sun begins to dip, the Nile sparkles with reflected gold, and boats drift lazily toward distant villages and temples. Oxen rest, workers wipe sweat from their brows, and scribes finally tuck their records away. The day's movements are complete, but the system never truly rests. Tomorrow, new harvests, new distributions, and new measurements will continue the endless cycle of storing, moving, and accounting for grain. For you, standing on the riverbank and watching this network in motion, it becomes clear that the grandeur of Egypt's civilization owes as much to this quiet logistics system as to temples, pyramids, or armies. Without careful transportation, without careful planning, even the most bountiful harvest would be meaningless. Grain's journey, from field to granary, from granary to temple, market, or home, is a story of human ingenuity, endurance, and foresight. And as the last boat disappears around a bend in the river, you realize that grain is never truly still. It flows like the Nile itself, connecting communities, sustaining lives, feeding gods, and maintaining the pulse of a civilization that thrived for millennia. By this point, you've seen the journey of grain from field to granary, its careful measurement, transportation along the Nile, and distribution to temples, workers, and communities. Yet all of these efforts, harvesting, measuring, transporting, would be futile without proper storage. In ancient Egypt, storing grain was an art as much as a science. The Egyptians developed ingenious methods to protect their lifeline from pests, moisture, theft, and spoilage, all while keeping it accessible for everyday use and ceremonial purposes. You step inside a large granary, the air thick with the earthy aroma of dried wheat and barley. Sunlight filters through narrow slits in the walls, casting thin lines across stacked sacks and clay jars. The storage space is organized with remarkable precision. Here, grain isn't just piled in heaps. It's carefully arranged in silos, bins, and specialized containers designed to maximize capacity while minimizing risk. One of the most common storage structures was the mud brick silo, cylindrical or rectangular in shape, often plastered on the inside to reduce moisture absorption. These silos could hold hundreds or even thousands of heqats of grain. Their construction was deliberate. Thick walls insulated against heat, while raised floors kept grain off the damp ground. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, preventing mold and spoilage. This combination of design elements demonstrates the Egyptians' advanced understanding of both climate and materials. You notice that many silos have carefully carved or painted inscriptions indicating the contents, quantity, and date of storage. These labels weren't just decorative, they were essential for rotation. Officials used this information to implement a first-in, first-out system, ensuring older grain was used before fresher harvests. It's a simple idea, but one that required diligence and discipline, especially in large state or temple granaries where thousands of heqats could be stored at once. Quirky tidbit: some granaries contained small clay figurines or amulets tucked into the silos, believed to ward off pests or protect the grain from supernatural forces. While today we might laugh at the idea of a tiny clay cat deterring weevils, it's a charming reminder that the Egyptians intertwined practical storage techniques with spiritual beliefs. After all, they saw the material and divine worlds as interconnected. Keeping grain safe was both a physical and symbolic act. Bins made from reed matting or baskets were another common method for smaller-scale storage. These were ideal for individual households, temple kitchens, or short-term allocations. While more vulnerable to pests than silos, their portability made them indispensable. Workers could transport grain between field, granary, and kitchen without risk of spilling large amounts, and their lightweight construction allowed for stacking in tight spaces. Historians still argue whether some of the largest granaries were primarily designed for efficiency or display. Some researchers suggest that monumental storage structures, especially near major temples, served as symbols of wealth and power. Large, imposing granaries demonstrated the pharaoh's ability to harness the Nile's bounty and feed both people and gods. Others insist their design was purely functional, driven by the need to store massive quantities of grain safely. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a blend of practicality and prestige. Protecting grain from moisture and pests was a constant concern. Mud brick silos often featured plastered floors and walls, but humidity remained a challenge. Workers would periodically inspect the grain, stirring and aerating it to prevent clumping and mold growth. Insects, particularly weevils and beetles, posed another threat. Some records indicate that grain was mixed with dried herbs, ash, or even sand to deter insects. Primitive but surprisingly effective techniques. You step closer to a set of raised storage platforms, each holding several clay jars. These platforms were elevated off the floor to reduce contact with moisture and rodents. Small moats or trenches sometimes surrounded them, further discouraging pests. Cats, as you've probably guessed, patrolled these spaces, ensuring that mice and rats had few opportunities to nibble on the precious harvest. It's a vivid reminder that storage wasn't passive. It required active management, observation, and care. Storage design also accounted for accessibility. Granaries needed to accommodate both large shipments from the field and small distributions to individuals. Wooden ramps, narrow aisles, and clearly labeled jars allowed scribes and workers to move efficiently through the space, taking only what was needed without disturbing the rest. Imagine the coordination required. One careless worker could topple a stack of jars or mix grains from different harvests, disrupting months of careful planning. Interestingly, some granaries featured layered storage systems where different types of grain or different harvest years were kept in separate sections. This allowed officials to track quality and origin, ensuring that certain allocations, such as temple offerings or elite rations, received the best grains. It also provided a buffer in case a particular batch became spoiled. The remaining grain could still sustain the population. In some rural households, small jars of grain were buried in the floor or tucked into hidden corners as emergency reserves. This personal granary system shows how Egyptians at all social levels were attuned to the importance of storage, and how cultural practices mirrored state strategies on a smaller scale. By the late afternoon, sunlight slants through the narrow ventilation shafts, illuminating the carefully stacked layers of grain. Workers move methodically, checking jars, brushing off dust, and ensuring everything remains in order. The rhythm of their labor is steady and deliberate, almost meditative, a quiet choreography that ensures food, economy, and ritual continue uninterrupted. It's humbling to realize that the survival of ancient Egypt depended not only on the Nile's generosity, but on the ingenuity and care of people designing and maintaining these storage systems. Silos, bins, jars, raised platforms, and ventilation shafts. Each was a small marvel, a triumph of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. Without them, even the most abundant harvest would have been vulnerable, wasted, or stolen. Standing in the granary, you feel a deep respect for these structures and the people who maintain them. They represent foresight, patience, and an understanding of the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity. Every mud brick wall, every carefully leveled jar, and every hidden amulet tells a story of human ingenuity in the service of survival, society, and spirituality. By now, you've seen grain harvested, measured, transported, and stored with extraordinary care. But behind every sack, every silo, every clay jar, there is a human network keeping the system alive. A combination of laborers, administrators, and scribes whose efforts ensured that Egypt's grain economy functioned smoothly. Without them, even the most sophisticated storage or distribution plans would crumble. You enter a bustling administrative hall adjacent to a major granary. Papyrus scrolls lie stacked neatly on wooden shelves, clay tablets covered in meticulous inscriptions. Scribes, quills in hand, move deliberately through the room, calculating, recording, and double-checking entries. Their presence is both authoritative and invisible. They wield no swords, yet they control the kingdom's lifeblood, grain. The role of scribes in ancient Egypt was vital. Highly trained in mathematics, accounting, and the hieroglyphic writing system, scribes were responsible for documenting quantities of grain, tracking storage, recording tax collection, and allocating rations to temples, workers, and soldiers. They essentially served as human ledgers, translating physical resources into written, verifiable records. Without scribes, granaries would be chaotic, rations inconsistent, and the state vulnerable to mismanagement. But scribes were just one part of the larger administrative network. Granaries relied on a hierarchy of officials: overseers who supervised laborers, supervisors who coordinated transport, and inspectors who verified quality and quantity. These roles were often hereditary, passed down in families skilled in administration or specialized labor. Their work ensured that grain moved efficiently from fields to silos, from temples to markets, and from state reserves to the people who depended on it. You notice a group of laborers unloading sacks from a cart. Their work is repetitive but essential, requiring careful coordination and attention. One misstep could spill a heqat or damage fragile jars. Laborers often worked in teams, each responsible for specific tasks. Some lifted, some carried, some arranged, and others recorded arrivals. While their labor might seem mundane compared to the grandeur of pyramids or temples, it was the backbone of Egypt's agricultural and economic stability. Quirky tidbit, some records indicate that workers were paid not just in grain, but in small amounts of beer, oil, or even bread shaped into amusing forms. These treats may have served to boost morale or reward efficiency, an ancient, slightly whimsical form of employee incentive. Imagine finishing a long day in a dusty granary and receiving a loaf shaped like a miniature duck or fish, your reward for careful work. Scribes often worked closely with these laborers, ensuring that every movement of grain was accounted for. Each entry in a papyrus ledger was cross-referenced with the physical sacks, jars, or heqats in storage. Mistakes could have serious consequences. Misreported quantities might result in shortages, disputes over taxes, or accusations of embezzlement. In some cases, officials were punished for negligence, while exceptional scribes and overseers were rewarded with extra rations, land, or positions of prestige. Historians still argue whether the system's efficiency was primarily due to bureaucracy or the social pressure of accountability. Some suggest that fear of punishment maintained rigor, while others argue that a deeply ingrained culture of responsibility and honor encouraged accuracy. Either way, the meticulous records left behind reveal a civilization keenly aware of the stakes involved in managing its most vital resource. In addition to standard accounting, scribes performed calculations for ration distribution, tax obligations, and emergency allocations. For example, during lean years or partial crop failures, officials could calculate the minimum necessary rations to prevent widespread hunger, prioritizing soldiers, temple workers, and urban populations. This required not only arithmetic skill, but foresight and understanding of the Nile's cycles, temple requirements, and human needs. The scribes' influence extended beyond administration. Some were involved in long-term planning, advising pharaohs and temple authorities on crop rotation, storage expansion, and surplus management. Their records helped predict shortages, plan construction projects, and ensure that temples could maintain offerings even during challenging years. They transformed simple quantities of grain into actionable intelligence, the kingdom's data analysts before computers existed. Quirky tidbit, there is evidence that scribes sometimes used small sketches of grain sacks, jars, or even tiny human figures in their notes to illustrate allocations visually. It's a subtle reminder that the Egyptian bureaucracy was not only precise, but also inventive, using visual cues to make complex accounting easier to interpret. You watch a senior scribe instructing apprentices, demonstrating how to calculate allocations and update ledgers. Precision is drilled into them. Every heqat must be recorded, every jar labeled, and every transport noted. Apprentices practice for years before handling official records independently, ensuring continuity and reliability across generations. Mistakes are corrected immediately, sometimes with additional calculations to verify accuracy. The granary itself functions as a stage where this human network performs daily. Laborers unload sacks, inspectors verify quantities, scribes record data, and overseers coordinate operations. Each role interlocks with the others, creating a system where efficiency, accountability, and foresight are essential. The result is a civilization that can not only feed its people, but maintain temples, armies, and bureaucracies over centuries. Standing back, you see the bigger picture. Grain is not just a commodity. It is a nexus of human effort, skill, and ingenuity. From the humble laborer hauling sacks to the scribe calculating allocations, each person plays a vital part in sustaining Egypt's lifeblood. The sheer scale of coordination is staggering. Thousands of workers, hundreds of scribes, and numerous officials all interacting seamlessly to ensure that grain moves where it is needed, when it is needed. And as the sun dips low, casting golden light across the granary walls, you can almost hear the rhythm of the work. Hands shifting grain, quills scratching papyrus, voices issuing instructions, and the occasional laugh or joke from a laborer. It's a living network, one that keeps the kingdom fed, temples thriving, and society balanced. The labor and administration behind grain remind you that civilization is built not only on monumental structures, but also on quiet, relentless diligence. By the time grain reaches this final stage of its journey, it has already traveled through fields, granaries, temples, scribes' records, and riverboats. Yet its influence stretches even further, shaping the rhythms of daily life, the economy, social structures, and the very identity of ancient Egypt. To truly appreciate the role of grain, you must imagine the countless households, temples, and communities that depend on it every single day. You walk through a small village near the Nile, baskets in hand, and notice the centrality of grain in ordinary life. Every family has some stored, enough for bread, porridge, and beer. Children play near stacks of emmer, while women grind kernels into flour using stone corns. Men haul sacks from local granaries or transport them to the river for trade. Grain is both sustenance and social glue, connecting people to the land, to each other, and to the cycles of the Nile. Mainstream fact, bread and beer, both made from grain, were staples of the Egyptian diet across social classes. The quality and quantity varied depending on wealth and status, but virtually everyone consumed some form of grain daily. Bread could be leavened or unleavened, coarse or fine, while beer was often a thick, nourishing brew consumed instead of water. Grain thus sustained not only life, but also work, religion, and leisure. At the village, you notice that grain also functions as a form of local currency. Families barter their surplus for pottery, tools, or textiles. A few heqats might buy a new sandal, while a larger sack could secure labor for harvesting. Even small farmers participate in a microeconomy built entirely around grain, echoing the larger state system. The same principle applies on the grander scale. Temples, soldiers, and craftsmen all rely on grain as a measure of value, a reward for work, and a medium of exchange. Quirky tidbit, some households kept small jars of barley buried under the floor or hidden in walls as emergency reserves. This secret granary could sustain a family through short-term crop failures. Some jars were even marked with playful symbols or miniature carvings to indicate they were off-limits, a domestic ritual that mirrored the state's careful grain storage in granaries and silos. Grain also structured time and labor. The planting and harvesting seasons dictated when people worked in the fields and when they could focus on craft, worship, or family. Festivals, temple offerings, and communal feasts all depended on a reliable supply of grain. The ebb and flow of the harvest shaped the calendar, reinforcing both agricultural and religious cycles. Historians still argue whether grain primarily drove social organization or merely reflected it. Some suggest that centralized storage, distribution, and measurement allowed the pharaoh to control labor and maintain social order. Others argue that these practices evolved naturally from communities' need to survive in a challenging environment. Either way, it is clear that grain influenced virtually every aspect of society, from economics to religion, from governance to daily routines. Even in moments of leisure, grain played a role. Children played with small piles of barley, stacking and counting, sometimes mimicking adult tasks in miniature. Adults enjoyed bread and beer while sharing stories, recounting local history, or preparing offerings for the gods. Festivals featured grain-based foods, temporary markets, and competitions, highlighting its importance not just for survival, but for cultural expression. The management of surplus is particularly fascinating. During years of abundance, grain was stored meticulously in state granaries and temple silos. These reserves enabled large-scale projects such as pyramid construction, military campaigns, and elaborate temple rituals. Workers received rations that sustained them through intense labor, while priests and officials could focus on spiritual duties and governance. Grain, in essence, fueled the engine of civilization, linking labor, administration, and faith in a continuous loop. You pause by a family preparing bread. The mother pours water over finely ground flour, mixes it into dough, and slides it into a clay oven. The aroma of baking spreads through the courtyard. This simple act, repeated countless times across centuries, encapsulates the essence of Egyptian society, a reliance on labor, knowledge, and resourcefulness to transform raw grain into sustenance, comfort, and ritual significance. Quirky tidbit, some local traditions included baking small figurines or symbols into bread, often as charms for luck, fertility, or protection. These playful customs highlight the intertwining of daily life, superstition, and creativity, showing that grain was never purely functional. It was also a medium for culture and imagination. Looking beyond individual households, you see the long-term legacy of Egypt's grain systems. The techniques developed for storage, measurement, and distribution informed the management of resources for millennia. Granaries, silos, and records were models of efficiency and foresight, influencing later civilizations in the Mediterranean and Near East. The integration of grain into religion, economy, and daily life created a template for societal resilience that resonates even today. In this final reflection, it becomes clear that grain was more than a commodity. It was the bloodstream of Egypt, circulating through temples, households, granaries, and fields, sustaining life, shaping culture, and reinforcing order. Every heqat measured, every jar stored, every loaf baked was a testament to human ingenuity, adaptation, and reverence for the natural world. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and the day's observations settle into memory, it's time to let the story drift into quiet reflection. The river flows gently in your imagination, the granaries stand silent and secure, and the laborers, scribes, and priests continue their eternal rhythm in the shadows of history. The world of grain, once so vital and tangible, fades softly, leaving a sense of calm and continuity. Slow your breathing. Imagine the gentle hum of a distant fan, the comforting weight of blankets, and the warmth of the Nile sun on your shoulders. The grain rests, the river flows, and for tonight, you are safely carried along with it. The sun has set over the Nile, and the granaries lie quiet, their walls holding centuries of care, labor, and devotion. The grain, once bustling with movement, now rests in orderly stacks, jars, and silos, waiting to be called upon by the people or the gods. The rhythm of the kingdom slows, just as your own heartbeat begins to synchronize with the soft cadence of the river and the hum of distant work fading into memory. Every kernel you've imagined tonight carries a story, of farmers kneeling in the fields, scribes carefully tallying their work, priests offering sustenance to the divine, and families turning grain into bread and beer. These tiny, unassuming seeds are threads weaving together economy, society, religion, and daily life into the vast tapestry that is ancient Egypt. The enormity of it is soothing, not overwhelming, because it reminds you of continuity, that civilizations, like nights and days, rise and fall, yet life persists through careful stewardship and human care. You may drift off thinking of the gentle clatter of riverboats, the scent of freshly baked bread, or the cool, shadowed interiors of temple storehouses. Perhaps you'll imagine tiny clay figurines tucked among the grain, silent guardians of abundance and order. The world slows. The uncertainty of floods and famine fades. All that remains is the steady pulse of life, the quiet diligence of countless hands, and the knowledge that even something as small as a grain of wheat can sustain empires, nourish communities, and carry us through centuries. Now, dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let your mind float among the golden fields, the flowing river, and the silent, enduring granaries. You are safe. You are carried. And as the story fades, you drift further into rest, wrapped in the soft embrace of history and the gentle promise of tomorrow. End of script. Sweet dreams.